From Elvis's first rebel yell in a Memphis studio to the Beatles storming American airwaves, music became the weapon that split generations in two. Witness how a single guitar riff ignited a cultural revolution, and how four mop-top lads finished the job on national television. This is the untold saga of sound, rebellion, and the battle for America's youth. In the sweltering summer of 1954, Memphis, Tennessee, was a musical crossroads. On a sweltering evening in July, 20-year-old Elvis Presley, a lanky truck driver with a shock of dark hair and an unmistakable swagger, walked into Sam Phillips's Sun studio on Union Avenue. Phillips, the owner and engineer, was searching for a white man who could sing soul. Presley, then known by locals simply as the Kid, picked up his acoustic guitar and began playing Arthur Big Boy Crudup's "That's All Right." What emerged from the studio's single microphone was neither pure country nor straight blues, but an electrifying hybrid. Presley's voice, alternately smooth and raw, rode atop Scotty Moore's stinging guitar licks and Bill Black's thumping slap bass. When Phillips hit the record button, he captured a moment of musical alchemy. Gospel-tinged vocal runs met the storytelling twang of country, underpinned by the rhythmic drive of rhythm and blues. Sam Phillips knew he had something special. He pressed a few copies of the acetate and handed them to disc jockey Dewey Phillips at WHBQ Radio, no relation, telling him, "Play it fast and see what happens." Dewey Phillips, a white man raised on Beale Street, was among the first radio personalities to play rhythm and blues. On July 29, 1954, he spun Presley's "That's All Right" on the air, framing it as a brand new sound from a kid you've never heard before. Teenagers across Memphis, fatigued by crooners and big band horn sections, heard for the first time a backbeat they could dance to, and a singer who sounded as if he were speaking directly to them. Within days, local crowds gathered outside Sun Studio, drawn by transistor radios clutched in sweaty hands. Word of mouth spread along crosstown traffic lines. "You gotta hear this Presley Kid." By early August, "That's All Right" was selling by the hundreds in juke joints and soda fountains. Elvis began performing live at the nearby Eagle's Nest and Bon Air Club, his gyrating hips and guitar-slung silhouette provoking screams and swirling skirts. Black and white teenagers danced cheek to cheek, defying segregation laws and baffling conservative onlookers. Meanwhile, Sam Phillips had negotiated a single record deal with RCA Victor. On November 5, 1956, RCA released Heartbreak Hotel, backed with "I Was the One." The record debuted at number 5 on Billboard's country chart and number 18 on the pop chart, signaling Presley's rapid rise. Radio stations coast to coast began adding his Sun sides to their rotation. When Presley appeared on national television that same year, performing live on the Dorsey Brothers' stage show, censors filmed him only from the waist up, his pelvis gyrations considered too risque for family audiences. The response from parents and moral crusaders was swift and vociferous. The National Association of Broadcasters received hundreds of letters demanding that Elvis be banned. Parent-teacher associations in suburban Ohio and Pennsylvania petitioned stations to pull his singles. Reverend Louis Sheldon, a prominent evangelical leader in California, denounced rock and roll as the devil's music, claiming it would lead children to promiscuity and drug abuse. In some southern towns, police raided dance halls hosting Presley's records, confiscating jukeboxes and fining owners for promoting immorality. Elvis confused, but remained undeterred. In interviews, he shrugged off critics. "I don't know nothing about no devil's music," he said. "I just sing what I feel." His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, spun controversy into publicity, declaring in a press release that Elvis's music was the sound of freedom and rebellion. This framing resonated with teenagers who felt stifled by conservative conformity and the lingering shadows of World War II. By 1957, Presley had sold over 1 million copies of Heartbreak Hotel. His debut album shot to number 1 on both the country and pop album charts. Film studios clamored to cast him in musicals. Love Me Tender debuted to record audiences in November 1956, shattering box office records for a first-time star. News outlets chronicled his every move: teen heartthrob status, girlfriend rumors, costume changes, and backstage antics. Despite ongoing attempts to diminish his influence, Elvis's popularity only soared. Cultural critics began to acknowledge rock and roll as more than a passing fad. Musicologist Alan Lomax predicted that the new sound would redefine American music as profoundly as the blues had done for African American traditions. Politicians, once dismissive, recognized that rock and roll had become a potent force in youth culture, both a challenge to authority and a potential unifier across racial divides. In Memphis, Mayor William B. Ingram even proclaimed an annual Presley Day, celebrating the local prodigy whose fusion of styles had placed the city on the map. Yet Presley's rise was not without peril. The $1 Million Quartet session in December 1956, when Presley, Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Carl Perkins jammed spontaneously at Sun Studio, was a rare moment of camaraderie before each artist faced his own battles with censorship, personal demons, and the turbulent music industry. For Presley, the pressures culminated in his Army draft notice in March 1918, which temporarily paused his career but further cemented his status as an American icon, one who served as both soldier and cultural lightning rod. By the end of 1958, Presley had laid the foundations not only for his own storied career, but for rock and roll as a global phenomenon. The raw fusion first captured in a small Memphis studio would reverberate through the following decades, inspiring British bands to revisit American roots, leading to the British invasion, and influencing generations of singers and guitarists. Elvis's first rebel yell echoed through every teenage bedroom, every sock hop, and every record store window. Chapter 1 concludes by reflecting on how a chance recording session transformed a young truck driver into the king of rock and roll and set America's youth on a collision course with tradition. From humble beginnings at Sun Studio to national radio revolution, Elvis's "That's All Right" became the spark that ignited a cultural wildfire, one that conservative parents and broadcasters could only try and ultimately fail to extinguish. Rock and roll was born, and with it, a battle for the hearts and ears of an entire generation. On September 9th, 1956, at precisely 8 o'clock in the evening Eastern Time, Elvis Presley stood behind a microphone on the set of the Dorsey Brothers televised stage show, broadcast live from New York City. His announcement was simple: "This is Elvis Presley, and I'd like to sing Heartbreak Hotel." In that moment, the lanky singer, donned in a black leather jacket, narrow tie, and polished shoes, took his place under the bright studio lights. As the band launched into the opening notes, Presley's voice, smoky, vulnerable, and full of simmering tension, filled the living rooms of millions of Americans. Then he moved. In the cramped studio space, where cameras tracked his every gesture, Elvis's hips began a subtle, sinuous swivel. His shoulders rolled, his knees bent ever so slightly. Viewers at home witnessed an eruption of raw physicality. For many teenagers, the sight of a handsome young man bending his legs in a way that suggested both pleasure and provocation was electrifying. They whispered to friends, "Did you see that? He's like a force of nature." But for network executives and parent-teacher associations, Elvis's gyrations threatened the moral fabric of the nation. Sponsors fretted that their products, cigarettes, household appliances, insurance, would be tainted by association with such indecency. In response, the show's producers instructed cameramen to frame Presley only from the waist up, cropping out the lower half of his body that they feared would incite juvenile delinquency. During rehearsals, the director warned Presley to mind your step and keep his movements within bounds. Yet on live air, even the waist-high shots conveyed enough of his trademark pelvic push to ignite outrage. Letters poured into the offices of the National Association of Broadcasters, decrying the unholy spectacle and demanding that Elvis be banned from television. Clergymen invoked the Book of Proverbs in sermons denouncing sensual music and warning congregations of the serpent's lure. One prominent parent-teacher group in Philadelphia passed a resolution urging local affiliates to refuse future bookings of Presley or any performer who encourages licentious behavior. Meanwhile, teenage fans, undeterred by adult disapproval, glued themselves to their sets, replaying reruns at friends' houses and practicing Presley's moves in front of bedroom mirrors. Within weeks, Presley's stage show appearance became a cultural lightning rod. Newspapers dissected every angle, with the New York Times editorializing that the youth of America must not be seduced by such provocative exhibition. In contrast, Variety noted that the program's ratings surged by 30%, proving that moral panic was good for business. For Elvis, the controversy only fueled his mystique. He returned home to Memphis in October, greeted by throngs of screaming teenagers at his hotel. Photographers captured images of girls pressing pressed flower notes and homemade letters into his hands, begging him never to change his style. Just 2 months after his television debut, Presley added another chapter to his reign, his first feature film role in Love Me Tender. Released on November 5, 1956 by 20th Century Fox, the Western-tinged musical drama starred Presley as Clint Reno, a young soldier returning home from the Civil War. On opening day, theaters in Los Angeles and New York sold out nearly all 100% of seats. Within its first week, the film grossed over 2 million tickets sold nationwide, shattering studio records for a first-time movie star. Critics offered mixed reviews. The Hollywood Reporter praised Presley's engaging screen presence, while the Los Angeles Examiner lamented that his on-screen charisma risks overshadowing the narrative. For parents and moral guardians, Love Me Tender's success compounded their fears. They saw Presley's transition from musician to movie idol as evidence that his influence over impressionable youth was expanding unchecked. In some southern towns, local censors cut scenes featuring Presley's close-up smolders and soft lips, replacing them with stock shots of cavalry charges. Church-sponsored youth groups organized boycott campaigns, posting flyers that read, "Beware the new idol," and warning teenagers that Hollywood's heart may break more than just this film. Yet the counter-revolution was already in motion. Teen magazines like Tiger Beat and 16 devoted full-page spreads to Presley's photographs, from stylized portrait shots to candid backstage smiles. Fashion editors noted sudden spikes in sales of black leather jackets and high-waist jeans among young readers who wanted to emulate Elvis's style. Radio stations, even those in conservative markets, found themselves unable to resist Presley's chart-topping singles, "Don't Be Cruel," "Hound Dog," "Love Me Tender." Each ascended to number 1 on Billboard's pop and R&B charts, effectively forcing local broadcasters to play his records regardless of moral objections. Presley's promotional tour for Love Me Tender further spotlighted the generational divide. He appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show on December 31, 1956, singing his film's title track in front of a live audience. Anticipation soared. Tickets were rationed by lottery. Yet network censors again insisted on chest-up framing and asked Presley to temper his hip movements. He complied, at least on air, but slipped in a silent wink and a subtle shoulder shimmy that teenagers recognized as a wink to their rebellion. The winter of 1956 solidified Elvis Presley's ascendancy as both the king of rock and roll and America's most divisive entertainer. His televised performances and cinematic ventures blurred the lines between music, film, and personal identity. Teenagers embraced Presley as the voice of their own dissatisfactions, against rigid social norms, post-war conformity, and parental control. Adults, alarmed by the rapid pace of cultural change, scapegoated him as the catalyst for youth misbehavior, drug use, and moral decline. Cultural critics and music historians later identified this period as the moment rock and roll exploded from regional novelty into national phenomenon. The dual successes of Stage Show and Love Me Tender demonstrated the power of mass media to amplify a single performer's reach. Television brought Presley's gyrations into living rooms that had never before witnessed such raw sexuality. Cinema immortalized his charm and celluloid for future generations. Together, they etched his image into the collective psyche. By early 1957, Presley was ensconced in American legend. Fan clubs sprouted in every state. Membership soared past 50,000 across hundreds of chapters. University students organized Elvis appreciation societies, where they screened his films and performed his songs in raucous campus gatherings. Meanwhile, the Church Federation of America held televised panels debating whether rock and roll was a threat to Christian values. Both sides acknowledged, however grudgingly, that Elvis Presley had become a force beyond simple appraisal. Chapter 2 closes on a note of uncertainty and transformation. At a time when the nation's cultural gates were cracking open, one man's voice and body language challenged inherited boundaries. Whether one saw Elvis as a liberator of youthful expression or as a harbinger of decay, his impact was undeniable. The king had taken the stage, and America would never look or sound the same again. By 1962, the roar of Elvis Presley's hip-shaking rhythms had quieted on the American home front. In March of that year, Presley received his draft notice and reported for duty at Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. Within weeks, he was sent to Friedberg, West Germany, where he served in the 3rd Armored Division. Away from Sun Studios' neon sign and the American charts, Presley traded his leather jacket for an Army uniform and spent weekends polishing tank turrets rather than studio microphones. His absence left a void on U.S. airwaves. Suddenly, radio disc jockeys had to find new stars to fill the teenage demand for rock and roll. Half a world away, in the gritty port city of Liverpool, England, a new sound was germinating. The Beatles, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Pete Best on drums, played their first gig at the Cavern Club on August 9, 1962. That subterranean jazz cellar on Matthew Street was their crucible. Nightly sets of rhythm and blues covers, skiffle-infused folk numbers, and early Lennon-McCartney originals honed under the pall of swinging speakers and cheering Liverpudlian youth. The city's economic slump, closed shipyards, rising unemployment, fueled a yearning for escape. Teenagers piled into the cavern's narrow brick corridors to lose themselves in the driving backbeat and hopeful harmonies of these 4 eager lads. Liverpool, with its docks linking Britain to America, had absorbed its own share of R&B records smuggled from New Orleans and Chicago. Local skiffle bands, using washboards, tea-chest basses, and acoustic guitars, had already created a do-it-yourself music culture. Lennon claimed that hearing Lonnie Donegan's Rock Island line in 1956 convinced him that you could make a racket, and people would go for it. By the autumn of 1963, the Beatles had transitioned from skiffle apprentices to confident rockers, drafting energetic originals like From Me to You and She Loves You, which blended Irish refrain structures with American soul grooves. In October 1963, the political wind shifted in Washington. Civil rights protests drew international attention to American social discord. British newspapers seized upon these images, and young UK audiences found fresh resonance in American rhythm and blues. The Beatles, ever attuned to transatlantic trends, toured Hamburg's clubs and refined their stagecraft. Back in Liverpool, budding fans scribbled lyrics on tattered ticket stubs, circulating copies of Please Please Me as though they were gospel tracts. The group's manager, Brian Epstein, secured a recording contract with EMI's Parlophone label after months of persistence. Producer George Martin, an erudite classical musician, recognized their raw talent and guided their first sessions at Abbey Road Studios in November 1962. Parlophone released Love Me Do that October, which climbed to number 17 on the UK charts by December. The little band of Liverpudlians had captured British hearts, but their ambitions soared higher. In late 1963, Capitol Records in New York hesitated to pick up She Loves You, dismissing it as too noisy. Frustrated, London executives penned a handwritten plea on Capitol letterhead to Ed Sullivan, CBS Television, imploring him to feature the Beatles on his renowned Sunday night variety show. The letter read, in part, "Our lads from Liverpool have a sound that is igniting the youth of Britain. We believe American teens will go wild for them, just as ours have. Please consider hosting the Beatles on your program." Unbeknownst to the Beatles, this letter became the cornerstone of their American breakthrough. Meanwhile, back home, Elvis's career was winding down. He performed soldiers' dances in Baumholder and watched his records tumble down the charts. American television moved on to the likes of Pat Boone and Bobby Darin. Rock and roll seemed yesterday's sensation. Then, on December 27, 1963, Capitol surprisingly released I Want to Hold Your Hand in the United States. Within days, the single shot to number 1 on Cashbox and Billboard's Hot 100, selling over 1 million copies by mid-January 1964. American disc jockeys began spinning the infectious harmonies and staccato guitar intro, and teenage girls responded with screams unheard since Presley's early days. Fan clubs sprouted in Philadelphia basements, Dallas drive-ins, and suburban living rooms. When the Beatles arrived at John F. Kennedy Airport on February 7, 1964, they were greeted by a swarm of over 3,000 fans, hardly the demure reception accorded most British entertainers. Newspapers splashed photographs of mop-haired quartet waving from an open-top convertible, their suits and narrow ties echoing both mod fashion and rock and roll rebellion. On Sunday, February 9th, the Beatles made their debut on The Ed Sullivan Show. An estimated 73 million viewers, 45% of the U.S. population, watched as the band performed All My Loving, Till There Was You, and of course, I Want to Hold Your Hand. The audience's frenzied screams overwhelmed audio engineers. Sullivan himself turned visibly astonished, exclaiming, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles!" The performance set nightly news headlines and shattered Sullivan's ratings records. Across America, teenage girls swooned, mimicking Lennon's accent and McCartney's bass lines. Parents listened in horror as their children clamored for Beatle boots and applied mop-top haircuts. Within a week, Capitol rushed out the album Meet the Beatles, which sold 500,000 copies by the end of February. Local guitar shops reported shortages of Rickenbacker basses. Dance halls that once favored twist and jive now booked live bands to learn Beatles covers. Yet conservative commentators decried the invasion. Historian William F. Buckley Jr. warned that longer hair and foreign accents signaled a weakening of American identity. Religious leaders spoke of the Beatles' menace, corrupting youth morals. Elvis Presley, hearing the commotion from abroad, recognized that a new era had begun. When he was discharged from the army in March 1964, he returned to a world in which the Beatles' harmonies had eclipsed his once dominant voice. Presley experimented with Broadway, gospel, and balladry in search of fresh relevance. Meanwhile, the Beatles, emboldened by their Sullivan triumph, launched a full American tour in August 1964, selling out Shea Stadium and solidifying their status as rock and roll rulers. Chapter 3 concludes by reflecting on how a letter scrawled in London, a single radio spin in New York, and a live TV performance ignited a cultural tsunami. Elvis's departure to the army created a vacancy that the Beatles filled and then expanded exponentially. Their arrival challenged America's musical hierarchy, sparked moral panics of its own, and forever altered the landscape of youth culture. The king had briefly ceded his crown, and the Beatles were poised to claim it in a glorious British invasion. On February 23, 1964, the lights dimmed in living rooms from Boston to San Diego as the Beatles made their historic debut on The Ed Sullivan Show. Some 73 million viewers, nearly 45% of the U.S. population, leaned forward as John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr launched into All My Loving. Their crisp harmonies and Lennon's cheeky grin sent a tremor through television sets. When the quartet segued into She Loves You, screams erupted, shaking camera mounts and sending young viewers spiraling into unprecedented fervor. Within hours, newspapers ran photographs of sobbing teens clinging to transistor radios. By the end of the week, record stores reported overnight sales surges. I Want to Hold Your Hand flew off shelves in increments of 100,000 per day. Billboard announced the single had vaulted from obscurity to number 1 in just 10 days, a speed unmatched in American pop history. Record executives, previously cautious about British imports, scrambled to clear warehouse stock and schedule repressings. Capitol Records, astonished by the demand, expedited shipments, instructing distribution centers to bypass wholesalers and ship directly to local retailers. Local radio stations, once segregated by region and format, unified their playlists to include not only Beatles hits, but also their live performances recorded off the Ed Sullivan broadcast. Teenagers formed impromptu fan clubs in school cafeterias. Beatles appreciation societies met on afternoons, trading pressed flower collages of Lennon's shaggy silhouette. Girls braided each other's hair to mimic McCartney's famous mop top, while boys practiced Harrison's guitar riffs in vacant garages. Across small towns and big cities alike, Beatlemania became a social phenomenon, a shared shorthand for teenage disruption. Yet as fans reveled, conservative commentators bristled. Columnist Dorothy Samuels of the Chicago Tribune warned that the Beatles threatened to erode our moral fiber, criticizing their slang-filled lyrics for encouraging disrespectful language among youth. In Life magazine, writer Arthur Luther decried the long hair as a flagrant sign of rebellion, urging parents to enforce hair-length ordinances and promote respectable appearance standards. On February 27th, the American Family Association issued a statement condemning the Beatles as agents of cultural subversion, fearing that rock bands could foment anti-establishment attitudes and erode trust in government and church. Even high schools weighed in. In Wichita, Kansas, the school board debated a motion to ban any music by foreign agitators. Principal Harold Whitman addressed parents. If we allow such music in our halls, we risk corrupting the discipline and obedience of our students. Meanwhile, PTA chapters in suburban Detroit held candlelight vigils, praying for the souls of children lost to the shrill screams of Beatle hysteria. Parents purchased noise-canceling earplugs and scoured their teenagers' bedrooms for contraband vinyl. Despite the backlash, or perhaps because of it, the Beatles pressed forward. In April 1964, they embarked on their first North American tour. Stadiums that once hosted baseball and rodeo now filled with tens of thousands of young fans. At Shea Stadium in New York, over 55,000 ticket holders packed the stands. The opening chord of Twist and Shout unleashed an earthquake of shrieks. Unable to hear themselves play, the band relied on Simon & Garfunkel's technical innovation, grainy film footage synced to studio recordings, ensuring that the audience experienced the music clearly despite the din. Each performance became a cultural flashpoint. In Dallas, police erected barricades to control crowd surges. In Miami, local ministers held anti-Beatles sermons across the street from concert halls. In Sacramento, a city council member unsuccessfully proposed a curfew to limit Beatles-inspired mischief. Yet newsreels, radio replays, and photo spreads only amplified the craze. Senate hearings convened by the Committee on Un-American Activities invited experts to testify on rock and roll's roots in communist insurgency, citing the group's foreign nationality as evidence of ideological infiltration. No concrete proof emerged, but the implication alone fueled public anxiety. The press coverage intensified when the Beatles released A Hard Day's Night, both the film and its accompanying soundtrack, in July 1964. Critics pointed to Alan Klein's management contract as evidence of financial profiteering at the expense of American artists. A handful of college deans barred their students from attending screenings, condemning the film's shameless portrayal of youth autonomy. Yet box office receipts shattered weekend records, grossing over $1 million in its opening weekend alone. Amid the uproar, musicologists began to recognize the Beatles' innovations. Dr. Leonard Rosen of Columbia University noted that their use of mixed major and minor chords expanded the emotional palette of pop music, while journalist and critic Richard Goldstein argued that Lennon's lyric, "I hope you'll understand," in She Loves You, conveyed an unprecedented emotional vulnerability. Still, such scholarly praise did little to quell the cultural skirmish. Instead, parents wielded newfound terms: Beatlemania, pop cult, teen rebellion, as weapons in broader Cold War anxieties over youth conformity and national unity. The tension reached a symbolic peak in September 1964, when Life magazine declared that the fourth class of Handkerchief University would receive honorary degrees in pop cultural studies, a tongue-in-cheek protest against academic rejection of pop music. In Los Angeles, an editorial in the Times warned of a generational chasm widening with every Beatles beat, arguing that youth ensconced in their own echo chambers risked alienation from civic responsibility. Yet the generational divide also sparked moments of connection. Some parents, initially wary, attended Beatles concerts with their children and found themselves tapping their feet along with "Can't Buy Me Love." Clergymen offered Beatles Bible study groups, using the band's lyrics as metaphors for spiritual lessons. "All You Need Is Love" became an anthem for church outreach programs. By the end of 1964, a grudging acknowledgement emerged that the Beatles had tapped into a fundamental human yearning for freedom of expression, communal joy, and the forging of a new cultural landscape. Chapter 4 closes on the paradox of Beatlemania, a tidal wave of youthful exuberance that both united and divided a nation. While teenagers found in Lennon's quip and Harrison's guitar a sense of belonging, adults faced the unsettling realization that the cultural authority they once took for granted could be challenged by four Liverpudlian lads with guitars and a dream. The stage had been set. Rock and roll was no longer just music. It was the epicenter of a generational revolution, one that would continue to reshape society for decades to come. By the spring of 1968, the face of American popular music had shifted dramatically. After 2 years in uniform, Elvis Presley returned home to pursue his comeback on December 3, 1968, in a landmark live television special on NBC. Clad in black leather and backed by a blazing rhythm section, Presley unleashed a medley of his greatest hits before 25 million homes. His gyrations felt less shocking amid the rising tide of youthful rebellion, yet they served as a reminder that the king, once the lone rebel, could still command national attention. Just months earlier, in June 1967, the Beatles had released their studio masterpiece, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, with its kaleidoscopic album cover, psychedelic arrangements, and lyrics invoking existential playfulness. The record became both a soundtrack and a manifesto for the counterculture. Songs such as Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and A Day in the Life stretched the limits of studio technology and lyrical abstraction. Within days, the album topped charts in both Britain and America, selling over 3 million copies worldwide within its first year. Against this backdrop, America's college campuses brimmed with protest songs. Folk revival icons Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and Phil Oakes sang of civil rights and anti-war solidarity. Dylan's The Times They Are A-Changin', released in 1964, became an anthem for students marching on Washington, while Baez's plaintive vocals at the 200,000-strong Vietnam War moratorium in 1969 galvanized youth discontent. Campus coffeehouses replaced fraternity mixers as live venues for socially conscious performers. Student-run radio stations spun the latest releases from Jefferson Airplane, Buffalo Springfield, and Crosby, Stills, and Nash, forging a shared identity rooted in defiance of establishment norms. Hollywood, too, embraced this wave of cultural upheaval. In July 1919, Dennis Hopper's Easy Rider premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, its road movie narrative capturing the restless freedom and fracturing values of a new generation. With Peter Fonda's freewheeling dialogue, Jack Nicholson's memorable $20 bill grin, and a soundtrack featuring Steppenwolf's Born to be Wild, the film became both a commercial and artistic triumph. By earning over $20 million at the domestic box office, Easy Rider demonstrated that studios could no longer ignore the counterculture's commercial clout. Meanwhile, music festivals emerged as epicenters of youth solidarity. The Monterey Pop Festival, held in June 1967 in coastal California, showcased emerging talents such as Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and The Who. Over 100,000 attendees, decked in tie-dyed shirts and braided hair, witnessed a 12-hour spectacle that blurred the lines between concert and commune. Hendrix's revolutionary guitar feedback on Wild Thing and Joplin's raw soul on Piece of My Heart elevated these artists to folk rock icon status overnight. The festival's success inspired the following year's Woodstock, where nearly 500,000 people gathered in August 1969 to celebrate peace, music, and shared ideals. The rapid diffusion of protest music and countercultural values did not go unnoticed by government authorities. From Washington, D.C. to state capitals, officials invoked obscenity statutes and licensing regulations to curb what they termed subversive content. Radio stations faced fines for airing songs with drug references, sexual innuendo, or criticism of the draft. The Federal Communications Commission received complaints about profanity in rapid-speed vocal delivery, an early echo of later rock subgenres. University administrators expelled students for hosting impromptu midnight concerts and encouraging draft resistance. As the 1970s dawned, pressure mounted on musical expression. In 1973, Congress passed more stringent indecency provisions under the Communications Act, empowering regulatory bodies to levy heavy fines and revoke broadcasting licenses for content deemed harmful to minors. Local sheriffs raided record stores selling Frank Zappa's satirical album Freak Out and Arthur Brown's flame-lit rock opera Fire. City councils in several Midwestern towns considered legislation to prohibit public gatherings where music with explicit or suggestive lyrics was performed. In 1985, a coalition of concerned parents and political figures founded the Parent Music Resource Center. Led by a senator's spouse, the group lobbied for voluntary labeling of albums containing references to violence, sexuality, or substance use. Their infamous Filthy 15 list targeted songs such as Prince's Darling Nikki and Twisted Sister's We're Not Gonna Take It, citing fears of moral decay. Record companies, fearing government intervention, agreed to a sticker system that identified potentially objectionable content. Advocates hailed this as a victory for parental rights. Critics decried it as a form of censorship that stigmatized artists and stigmatized youth tastes. Throughout these clashes, musicians navigated the tension between creative freedom and societal constraints. Some, like Bruce Springsteen, frame their songs within narratives of working-class struggle, avoiding overt political slogans while still channeling communal frustrations. Others, such as the punk pioneers, The Clash and Dead Kennedys, embraced shock tactics, graffiti scrawled on album covers, jarring rhythms and scathing lyrics, to challenge both authority and complacent listeners. Their DIY ethos rejected mainstream distribution, favoring underground tape trading and small venue shows. Despite continued attempts at suppression, each new crackdown often backfired. Trials over obscenity, like the 1979 case against rap group 2 Live Crew, attracted free speech defenders and allied public interest groups to the artist's cause. Benefit concerts raised funds for legal defenses, turning courtroom debates into public festivals of solidarity. When District Court Judge Benito Romano ruled in 1991 that the group's album was protected by the First Amendment, it set a landmark precedent shielding musical expression from content-based bans. By the mid-1990s, the battle lines drawn between authority and youth had yielded a precarious détente. The advent of digital music distribution, first through audio cassette duplication and later via the internet, rendered geographic censorship obsolete. Listeners accessed banned songs as readily as those deemed wholesome. Conservative commentators shifted focus to video game violence and explicit rap lyrics, repeating historical patterns of generational conflict. Yet the era's fundamental lesson endured. Music, in its capacity to unite bodies and minds, remained a potent battleground over values, freedom, and identity. Chapter 5 concludes by reflecting on how a seemingly simple juxtaposition of a leather-clad Elvis, a psychedelic Beatles album, a college sit-in, and a pirate radio broadcast generated seismic shifts in American culture. The collision of authority and youth forged a turbulent but fertile terrain in which each side tested the boundaries of expression and control. From government offices to basement parties, from radio frequencies to festival fields, the soundscape of the 1960s and 1970s became the crucible in which modern concepts of artistic liberty and generational solidarity were fervently, and often painfully, forged. By the early 1970s, the tremors that began in a small Memphis studio and on an Ed Sullivan stage had rippled across the globe, reshaping music, culture, and youth identity in profound and lasting ways. Elvis Presley's gospel-tinged ballads and the Beatles' groundbreaking studio experiments provided the springboard for every subsequent musical movement, from the rebellious snarls of punk rock to the sampling-rich textures of hip-hop. In universities, lecture halls, and living rooms, scholars and fans alike came to describe rock and roll as the soundtrack of a generation, a shorthand for the ideals, anxieties, and aspirations that defined youth culture through decades of upheaval. The echoes of the King and the Fab Four. Elvis Presley, who in 1954 had fused blues, country, and gospel into a new vernacular, continued to influence artists across genres. His emotive vocal style, soaring falsettos followed by raw, chest-thumping shouts, became a template for soul singers like Otis Redding in the 1960s and for power ballad rockers of the 1980s. His recording of If I Can Dream in 1968, replete with strings and a choir, anticipated the anthemic stadium rock ballads of the 1970s and 80s. Likewise, the Beatles' innovations, close-mic'd vocals, tape loops, backward guitar parts, and sitar textures on Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, heralded the studio itself as an instrument. Musicians from Pink Floyd to Radiohead would cite the Abbey Road sessions as proof that rock records could be immersive works of art, not just live performances captured on tape. Punk, new wave, and the rebellion reborn. In the mid-1770s, as the post-Woodstock optimism faded, A new breed of artists recoiled against what they saw as rock's self-indulgent excesses. Punk rock, spearheaded by bands such as the Ramones in New York and the Sex Pistols in London, stripped music to its core. 3 chords, snarled vocals, and a do-it-yourself ethos borrowed directly from early rock and roll's spirit. Johnny Ramone later credited Elvis's Jailhouse Stomp and the Beatles' frenzied She Loves You guitar riff as the blueprint for punk's urgent simplicity. New wave acts like Talking Heads and Blondie fused art school sensibilities with pop hooks, continuing the Beatles' legacy of merging experimentation with melody. Hip-hop's sampling of history. By the late 1970s, the advent of affordable samplers and drum machines allowed artists to repurpose recorded sound as raw material. Pioneering hip-hop DJs in the Bronx, like Kool Herc and Grandmaster Flash, looped drum breaks from James Brown records, whose funk-injected grooves owed much to Presley's R&B influences, and shouted out early Beatles lines they'd heard on pirate radio. Run DMC's collab with Aerosmith on Walk This Way in 1986 demonstrated rock and rap's shared roots. Hip-hop's emphasis on social commentary and community storytelling echoed the protest songs of the 1960s folk revival, closing the circle that began with Dylan and Baez, Rituals of Remembrance. Elvis's anniversaries and Beatles' album reissues became cause for mass commemoration. Each January, fans flocked to Graceland for Elvis Week, a 5-day gathering marking his birthday, with tribute concerts, gospel sing-alongs at the Dove Chapel, and screenings of his early films. In June, Beatles enthusiasts traveled to Liverpool for the International Beatle Week Festival. Cavern Club performances, guided tours to Penny Lane and Strawberry Field, and late-night vinyl-only dance parties. In 1999, Apple Corps released the Yellow Submarine songtrack, remastering monomixes for the first time, while RCA reissued Presley's Sun singles on 6-disc box sets with unreleased alternate takes, introducing their magic to a new millennial audience. Academia takes note. By the 21st century, rock and roll had earned a place in university curricula. Courses titled Rock Music in American Society and The Beatles in the 60s examined how Presley's integration of black musical forms challenged segregation, and how the Beatles' embrace of Eastern philosophies on Revolver paralleled the counterculture's spiritual quests. Scholarly monographs trace the lineage from Elvis's gospel roots through Dylan's folk protests to punk's anthems of alienation and hip-hop's street-level commentary. Journal articles debated whether rock's persistent entrepreneurial spirit, its early indie labels and pirate radio roots, set the stage for today's streaming revolutions. New generations, old debates. Despite the reverence, controversy remained. When contemporary artists sampled Presley's vocals without permission, copyright debates flared, echoing the moral panics of the 1950s over rock's influence. When a viral video miscredited the Beatles' Come Together riff to a corporate jingle, fans and lawyers alike cried foul, reminding the world that cultural appropriation and commercial exploitation were as volatile now as ever. Debates over lyrical content, drugs, sexuality, political dissent, continued in parental advisory stickers and streaming platform guidelines, tracing back to the 1980s PMRC hearings and 1950s moral crusades. The revolution's enduring beat, today, every new wave of musicians contends with the ghosts of Presley and Lennon. A garage band's distorted guitar chords nod to the raw energy first captured at Sun Studio. A bedroom producer's lush synthesizer pads recall the phasing effects pioneered on Sgt. Pepper. Streaming playlists titled Origins of Punk or British Invasion Essentials chart a direct path from those defining moments in Memphis and on Ed Sullivan's stage to the playlists of suburban teenagers in Seoul, Lagos, and São Paulo. The legacy of sound and rebellion resides not only in riffs or vocals but in the communal experience of music, live shows, and online fan forums alike. It lives in the defiant foot tap of a child hearing rock and roll for the first time, and in the solidarity of voices raised against injustice. As long as artists challenge convention and youth hunger for new expression, the revolution sparked by Elvis's "That's All Right" and the Beatles' harmonies will continue to pulse, reminding each generation that music can be both mirror and map, reflecting societal change and guiding it forward.